In order to truly call ourselves hunters, we have to also maintain the label of a conservationist. It's important for us to always consider the health of the populations of the animals that we're hunting to make sure that they are living in areas where they have sufficient habitat and provide them with the best opportunities to continue to thrive and grow as a population. As deer hunters and as hunters in general, we have to always be appreciative of the groups that are out there, whether it be conservation groups, nonprofit groups, whatever those groups may be. We have to be appreciative of the groups that are out there in the field, getting their hands dirty and making sure that we have these resources available and we have these animals available to hunt and that their habitats are sufficient enough to support them and their growing populations. Unfortunately, we are facing many types of different diseases that could potentially affect our wildlife and wildlife in habitable areas, and we must do what we can in order to help lower the amount of occurrences and exposures to different types of diseases, and we have to do the best we can to support groups that are out there researching and learning more and discovering more things about these types of diseases. This is why I wanted to have Kip Adams on today. Kip is the conservation director for the QDMA, so that's the Quality Deer Management Association. We have a great conversation today all about different deer diseases like EHD, and he really breaks down the severity of CWD, chronic wasting disease, and really challenges us as hunters to consider the entire landscape of the population of deer populations and to be diligent with our choices and to be diligent with how we care for animals after we have harvested them. He really provides us with some great information on how we're supposed to manage deer in order to prevent the spread of CWD. And before this conversation, I didn't really have a great grasp of the severity of CWD. And this was a real eye-opening talk that I had with Kip because he provided some really good information that applies not only to deer hunters, but just hunters in general. The idea of being a conservationist and the idea of being a hunter, those things go hand in hand. And as hunters and as conservationists, we have to always appreciate the work that's being done by these groups and to always lend the helping hand, because without groups like this, we aren't going to be able to enjoy the things that we're passionate about and be able to enjoy the animals that we enjoy to hunt and be able to enjoy the outdoors the way that we have been able to in the past. So it's important for us to make sure that we are appreciative of groups like this. And I really think you guys are going to enjoy this talk that I have with Kip Adams today. Before we get into that, I just wanted to share a few quick announcements with you. If this is your first time listening to the Rice Elite podcast, I want to thank you for listening today. My name is Tyler Pruitt. I am the host of the Rice Elite podcast, and I'm also the co-founder of RKE Afield. So the Rice Elite podcast is a show for people who love God, freedom, and the great outdoors. My goal of this show is to really connect with people and share their stories and share what they're doing in the hunting communities and to share what really drives them to be passionate about the outdoors. And at the end of each episode, I always ask my guests what hunting means to them. And that's been an incredibly moving part of this show, that since we've started it, being able to hear the responses of people like Jeff Danker and like Jack Carr and Josh Carney, and being able to hear the responses of people that are in the hunting community who have been in it for a while, and to still hear their passion that they still have for hunting is just, it's really refreshing for me as a relatively young hunter, and I'm excited about the future. So if this is your first time listening to the Rice Elite podcast, thank you. Go ahead and click subscribe, because I've got some really good ones, including this one today, coming your way. So I'm really excited for where the future of this show is going. If you are a returning listener, then thank you for coming back for another show. Thank you for the continued support that you continue to give me. I really do appreciate it. And like I've said in my past episodes, without an audience, I'm just sitting here talking to nobody. So you guys are really what makes this show, and I'm very appreciative of the continued support and the continued outreach that you guys are putting out there. And I mean, this show has really grown simply by word of mouth because of the great listeners, the continued support that I have from you guys. So thank you guys so much. I always like to challenge you guys to leave me a review and a rating in iTunes or wherever you're listening to this podcast, because those ratings and reviews, they go a long way with being able to help us to spread the word of the Rice Elite podcast and get that out there for new potential listeners to be able to listen to it. So be sure to do that. Be sure to leave me a review. sure to leave me a rating. I try to read all those reviews, everyone that I can. So be sure to do that. And I appreciate all the positive reviews that you guys are giving up to this point. So thank you guys so much. If you haven't checked out RKE Afield, so that's RKE as in Rise, Kill, Eat, RKE Afield on social media, be sure to do that. We're on Instagram, we're on Facebook, still working on getting some of our episodes up on YouTube. So be sure to check us out. Be sure to connect with us on there. Give us a like, give us a follow. That's RKE Afield. So that's on Facebook. That's going to be facebook.com/RKE Afield. And then on Instagram, that's at RKE Afield. Then, of course, the same name on YouTube. So thank you guys for listening today. Be sure to connect there. And I think you guys are really going to enjoy this show, this great conversation that I have with Kip Adams. So again, this is going to be one of those episodes where it may be helpful for you to take some notes. So get out your notebook, get out your pen, get out your pencil, and take some notes as Kip Adams really lays down the basics and everything that we need to know as hunters for CWD, EHD, and just deer management in general. So sit back, take some notes, and enjoy the show. This is episode 21, Managing Deer Diseases with Kip Adams. Thank you very much for agreeing to come on tonight. I appreciate it. I appreciate you taking some time this evening to talk with me.
My pleasure.
I was looking on Instagram, and it looked like were you guys on set with, was that Bearded Buck recently?
Yeah, it was, yeah, in kind of western Pennsylvania. So we've done some other stuff with the Bearded Buck in the past, and we're going to do just even more with them going forward. So we shot a lot of video the last few days.
Was there any specific topics you guys were covering? I mean, I know deer season's coming up here. I'm sure a lot of it was dealing with that.
Yeah, we've shot about 60 different management tips, or either biology tips or management tips. They're run on all their shows, kind of like a QDMA management minute. So we talked about all kinds of stuff from deer biology to management to habitat management. So a lot of that stuff. But then we spent all day Tuesday walking parts of the property and in the woods, putting together a management plan for them. So that's all habitat based. So that was the focus of that was habitat. Focus of all the management tips was the entire gamut of deer biology and ecology and management. So I got to talk a little bit about a lot of different things.
So that's a lot of the type of things that QDMA does, isn't it? It's dealing with a lot of the, managing deer herds and, looking at different types of diseases that are going on with whitetail deer population. Is it just whitetail deer or is it all types of deer?
Yeah, we 99% of our work is with whitetails. A lot of the stuff with whitetails bleeds over into mule deer management, but we work almost entirely with whitetails. The habitat info that we share and teach people benefits a whole host of other species, but the vast majority of it is done in the name of whitetails.
Yeah, so you said that was up in Pennsylvania. Is that where you are currently living?
Yeah, I live in north central Pennsylvania, so they're 3.5 to 4 hours southwest of me. And Matt Ross is in upstate New York. So Matt actually flew to Pittsburgh and then got a ride over. I'm close enough I could easily drive from my house, but I do live in north central Pennsylvania.
Did you grow up in Pennsylvania? Is that a place that you have always lived in? I mean, is that a place that you're familiar with just from your childhood?
Yeah, Pennsylvania's home, and I spent a decade in New Hampshire and Florida. I went to grad school in New Hampshire, to the state of Florida, and worked for the state wildlife agency for 4 years. Went back to the state of New Hampshire and worked as the New Hampshire Fish and Game's deer and bear biologist, and then came back to Pennsylvania 17 years ago now. I've been with QDMA 17 years. So my job that I have as our director of conservation, I travel throughout the country to work. So I don't have to work out of our national office. I get to pick, where I want to live to a certain extent, but Pennsylvania falls within where I can, so that works out well for me.
What kind of changes or I guess the differences in the deer population have you seen from your different areas that you lived in? Comparing Pennsylvania to New Hampshire and Florida, and I'm sure there's probably some differences in the overall population between those different areas, just based on geographical and climate. All those things have a factor in how deer populations are growing in those areas.
Yeah, absolutely. Big differences in those three. New Hampshire is at the northern limit of whitetail range. New Hampshire is a granite state because most of the soil there are granite or sand. So, lower productivity deer herd, terrible winter conditions in a fair amount of that state. So, much lower deer densities than you have in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania's kind of right in the sweet spot of deer management in the country. That mid-Atlantic region is far enough north that you get some big deer, far enough south that we don't get that much winter kill, and really good growing conditions throughout most of the state. So real high densities of deer, kill some really big deer here. Great age structure with regard to how the agency is managing this now. So a lot of good things going on in Pennsylvania. Florida being, almost everything there is sandy soils, give a much smaller subspecies of deer and, just lower quality food on average than you do outside of Florida, just most of that coastal region and all that sand. So um, absolute advantages to managing deer in all three of those places. Certainly some disadvantages in all three as well. That's one of the cool things about managing deer is that you can't do it the same everywhere. There's intricacies in a specific area that make it a little challenging, and that's what makes it a lot of fun.
So are there actual like different? I've always heard this. I don't know if it's a myth or not. And of course, you'd be able to tell me. But are there actual different sizes in the deer? I mean, is it because of food supply? Is it because of heat dissipation, just biological issues that are especially down in Florida where it's going to be much hotter than it would be in New Hampshire? Is there an actual body size difference between white-tailed deer down south versus the northern?
In Florida, there is. Just because it follows Bergman's rule. So as you get closer to the equator, species tend to get smaller. So there are. It doesn't mean you can't grow big deer in Florida, and they certainly do. But just on average, their subspecies of whitetail is smaller than the one we have here in Pennsylvania or New Hampshire, or as you get farther north into Canada.
Yeah, I've always seen some pretty big deer coming out of the northern region. I mean, it seems like it's almost a common occurrence. I mean, that like you said, the Pennsylvania area, the Ohio. I live in Kentucky, so of course we get some big deer that come out of Kentucky just about every year. But it seems like that kind of sweet spot, that sweet area, like you said, the Mid Atlantic area is where it's at as far as deer hunting goes. If you're into, of course, big bodied deer.
Yeah, and then where you are in Kentucky, you have, they kill some huge deer there each year, particularly from Western Kentucky, from an antler growth standpoint. You're in a very good region as well. For the most part, the body size that you have there are almost identical to what we have in Pennsylvania. Any differences would be more attributable to management on those properties than anything else. So yeah, we basically have the same deer that you guys have. However, you guys on average, tend to kill a lot or you kill more, really large whitetails where folks are really moving deer into some of the older age classes and, and really enhancing habitat for them. I think your ceiling is a little higher in parts of your state than they are in parts of Pennsylvania.
Why do you think that is? You think it's a more of a cultural thing, or you think it's just a hunter preference thing, or is it just? I mean, what could be contributing to some bigger, more quantity, I guess, bigger bucks coming out of Kentucky?
Well, part of it is the land use patterns, particularly in the western part of your state. You have really good soils. The soils alone don't explain that much of the differences in antler growth patterns. What it does, though, is the land use on those soils. So, for example, soybeans grown in western Kentucky are no more nutritious than they are grown in Pennsylvania or even Florida. Each individual leaf has the same basic nutrient components. However, where you have better soils, the yield of those fields, is much higher. And you end up with a lot more agricultural production because of it. So where I'm in Pennsylvania, so much of the state is just heavily forested. On a per acre basis, land in early successional vegetation or agriculture provides a lot more high quality food than a comparable acre of forests. So You just have a really nice mix of forest and ag in particularly not just Western Kentucky, but particularly Western Kentucky that just really relates to some of the big deer that come from that region.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. I actually live in Moorhead, which is on the northeast side. It's kind of right on the edge of the Appalachian Mountains, and the main farm I hunt on is a soybean field, and it's one of, I mean, in this area, it's like the county I live in. Like the southern half of the county is like mountainous areas. There's not a whole lot of flat land, but then the northern part is where some of the agriculture areas are, and it seems like the northern area is where a lot of those those bigger deer, the higher chance of seeing deer is going to be just because of the agriculture presence there. That's actually there. I have seen some deer in the forested areas, like the national forest area, but it's not nearly as common as it would be in the agriculture areas. I can definitely see that.
So, and that's not to say that you can't grow big deer in forested areas. And they certainly do. They do it in Saskatchewan
Right.
and New England and everywhere else. Just you're able to grow a lot more of them on a per acre basis in areas where you also have a lot of agriculture and or early successional vegetation rather than forests.
Exactly. Yeah. So you said that you were director of conservation with QDMA. So, as director of conservation, I mean, what all are you involved with? What are you responsible for as far as on a national level or on a regional level? So, as the director of conservation, what exactly does that look like for you?
I do most of my work at the national level, and it is I'm very blessed. I have a great job. As director of conservation, I oversee our REACH program, and REACH is an acronym that stands for Research, Educate, Advocate, Certify, and Hunt. So I oversee all of our research efforts. Securing funding for research projects, being involved in research projects. The educate part are all of the educational materials that we create or develop. So I get my hand in all of that. Have a big presence in our advocacy arena, where we get involved in over 100 legislative issues annually that impact deer hunting. So we spend a lot of time fighting for deer hunters on their behalf at the legislative level. Certify as our certification programs. And I oversee our deer steward courses, our land certification programs. That's very fulfilling work, to see the amount of or the number of people who learn more about managing deer and habitat, and enhance their stewardship knowledge. And then just the sheer acres that are involved. We recently added up acreage impacted by attendees of our deer steward classes. Those are classes we actually teach each year. And in the last decade, or actually just over a decade now, our attendees have impacted between 10 and 15 million acres of land. So it's very fulfilling, that we are having a huge impact actually on the ground, for habitat for deer and a whole suite of other wildlife species. And the last is the hunt. That's our hunting heritage program. This is our youth program. Our recruitment efforts, where we are trying to get youth and adult onset hunters in the woods, trying to curb that trend of fewer hunters. So great staff, that works with me and that I get to oversee, and I'm very lucky to do what I do and get my hand involved in a whole bunch of things that are very rewarding.
Yeah, it sounds like a great program. I mean, those are all obviously things that we are always needing. I mean, the number of deer hunters and just the number of hunters in general is, of course, on the decline. And I mean, that's something that I've really appreciated about the QDMA is just their ability to obviously share resources on managing whitetail deer, but also the hunter recruitment side, the advocacy side. So being able to speak out and stand up for issues that deer hunters care about, and that's something that I've really admired about what the QDMA has done and what it sounds like you've been doing with this with the Reach program.
Yeah, the entire staff at QDMA works on the different programs that I talked about, and more. But I'm in a unique position to, get to oversee that, really able to help have an impact on what is most needed. 20 years ago, or 17 years ago when I started, it wasn't hunter recruitment, it wasn't CWD or disease, but those are two of by far the biggest things that we work with today. And so it's nice to be able to really dedicate time and resources to the biggest issues of the day.
Absolutely, absolutely, and it's definitely needed. And like you said, as things have changed over the decades, I mean, it's we've really seen a switch in this concentration on making sure that hunter numbers are growing, and making sure that we're introducing people to the outdoors and introducing people to hunting. And it's I think a lot of it kind of stems from the just the freedom in knowing like where your food is coming from. And of course, whitetail deer is in a lot of areas in North America, and a lot of areas in the United States. It's a resource that's through conservation efforts has been made available for a lot of people for food purposes and for hunting purposes. And that's something that QDMA there. I mean, you guys are got your hand right in the middle of it. You're right in the mix of things, and it's something that is something that as a hunter I can definitely appreciate. As a whitetail hunter, I can definitely appreciate.
It's a good spot to be for sure, and we like being right there and helping all we can.
Sounds like a dream job.
I'm very blessed. I'm the first to admit how fortunate I am.
So what exactly is the QDMA? I mean, we've kind of touched on it a little bit, but what all does it is the QDMA responsible for? Can you kind of go into that a little bit more? What exactly the QDMA is?
Sure, we're a national nonprofit wildlife conservation organization with a mission to ensure the future of white-tailed deer, wildlife habitat, and our hunting heritage. So we work with hunters, landowners, natural resource professionals across the whitetails range, to help provide good information to allow them to be better stewards of our natural resources. We work with the state and provincial wildlife agencies to help set good deer management programs. We work with legislators to have good policy for deer hunting, and then we work with hunters to help them really execute the plan and be good stewards of the natural resources. Fully recognize that our state wildlife agencies can come up with the best deer plans in the world, but if hunters don't execute them, then they're going to fail. So we spend a lot of time working with hunters and providing them the information that they want about deer, how deer see, how deer hear, how to manage deer. Uh, then all the landowners, how to enhance habitat for deer and other species. So there's a lot of teaching involved. And at the end of it, we're hunters ourselves. I've been a wildlife biologist for well over 20 years now, and but I started as a deer hunter. And I am first and foremost a deer hunter. So um, I like it that is the heart of QDMA. We are hunters. We work with hunters. We understand how hunters think and what hunters want. And in many cases, we're able to be liaisons between hunters and the state wildlife agencies to make sure that the two are working together as cooperatively as they possibly can, and just to make sure that we are doing everything possible to provide good, healthy, sustainable deer populations and hunting opportunities long into the future.
Yeah, it sounds like, I mean, of course, QDMA and all these other organizations, these management organizations, whether it be the state wildlife organization or these, private nonprofit, it sounds like, I mean, you guys, like you said, you come up with a plan, but without the execution from the hunters and without the execution from the people who are prioritizing these deer and who value the deer and wildlife, without that, without their execution, then it's simply the plan doesn't really gain a whole lot of ground, just because I mean there's nobody to execute it. I mean that's what I'm kind of getting from that. And that's something, like I said, as a hunter I can definitely appreciate, because I mean our whitetail numbers overall, I feel like, I mean I'm fairly young, so I can't necessarily go back too far, but just from what I know from history and what I know from teaching myself on a whole lot of the history of wildlife populations, that wildlife numbers and whitetail deer specifically numbers are at a good point compared to where they have been in the past.
Yeah, they are. No, they certainly are. And your comment regarding the wildlife agencies and working with hunters, we work with the vast majority of state wildlife agencies, and some put a lot more emphasis on working with hunters than others do. And we have a great relationship with your agency there in Kentucky, and I can honestly say, they understand how important it is to engage hunters and then to work with them. And you know how good hunting is there in Kentucky. We certainly recognize that Kentucky has a very good deer management program. I'm very proud of what they have there, and Kentucky does a lot of work to engage the agency with hunters, and does a lot of listening, does a lot of sharing information, and that's important today. The history of deer and wildlife management really was the agencies kind of were the authority, and they provided the seasons and bag limits and just expected hunters to follow. And that worked well, 50 or 60 years ago, but it's very different today. Hunters are more knowledgeable than they've ever been about deer biology and management and enhancing habitat. So they want to be involved in the process more than in the past, and agencies that are accepting of that and are engaging them, are tend to be the ones that are doing much better today with regard to having successful deer management programs. So, and Kentucky certainly on that list. And, in fact, they've won our Wildlife Agency of the Year award in the past because of some of those efforts.
Yeah, definitely the level of involvement of hunters in Kentucky and just hunters in general and like the Midwest region and that kind of thing. Uh, just the level of, like you said, the amount of knowledge that we have access to is pretty incredible. And just in my maybe a few years, handful of years of that, I've actually been hunting and wanting to learn more about deer biology and learn more about wildlife biology and that kind of thing. I've been blessed with the opportunity to be able to have resources available to where I can look up, and I can look up guys like you, and I can look up resources like QDMA. I can look up resources like uh, National Deer Alliance and all these different organizations who've put together a lot of different research articles or different kind of resources to allow hunters to educate themselves more and more. And that's definitely, I think, been very much of a game changer. And I feel like I'm learning more and more, every year that I'm out there in the field hunting.
Yeah, that's a great thing. There's definitely more information available today. Still, lots and lots of research that's going on, but just the availability of that to the average hunter today is far greater than it's ever been before. And there's a lot of information that's not necessarily true, but the vast majority of science-based information that is available today is at a much higher level, and that's a great thing. We're in a very good age of deer hunting right now.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, I really wanted to bring you on, to kind of discuss the whole deer disease thing. I mean, CWD, EHD. We always hear these acronyms. We always hear these abbreviations of things, and we just don't. I feel like the general deer hunting population, myself included, honestly, to a certain degree, we don't really know a whole lot of it. I mean, we know it's bad. We know it's something that's not good for deer populations, but we're not exactly sure on the specifics of things and what the implications mean for deer populations, what the implications mean for wildlife biology in general, and just the future of hunting. Just to kind of lead into this, can you kind of break down the differences between EHD, what EHD actually is, compared to CWD? I know that there's a lot of information there, but can you kind of package those apart for a layperson to understand?
Sure. EHD is epizootic hemorrhagic disease. It's a viral disease that's carried by biting midges, or we often call them no-see-ums. Some people call it EHD, some people call it HD. You'll hear some people refer to it as blue tongue. And essentially, EHD and blue tongue are the same disease. They're just a different strain of the virus that causes it. So, because of that, they're often just collectively grouped together and referred to as hemorrhagic disease. Now, this is the disease that we see during the summer and early fall. Um, Importantly, though, not all deer die from it. It does kill some deer. A lot of deer that contract the disease actually survive. And if they survive, then they have antibodies that will protect them against that strain of the disease in the future. So that's important to know. It's a very common disease of white-tailed deer. It's nice that it does not kill all of them, and it tends to be very localized. So you may be in an area that's experiencing an outbreak of hemorrhagic disease, and there may be a bunch of deer dying right around you, and literally 5 miles down the road, there can be no impact at all. This is since it is carried by those biting midges or the no-see-ums. As soon as we get a couple of frosts in the fall, the disease is essentially done for the year. So because the carriers of it, those midges, are gone. So it's also important to know this disease happens somewhere in the United States every year, and it used to be thought of as a disease of the Southeast U.S. And I vividly remember when I was in undergraduate school at Penn State back in the late 80s and early 1990s. Uh, when it came time to talk about hemorrhagic disease, they said, this is a disease that deer in the southeast get. And that was about all they talked about because it was not in Pennsylvania, it was nowhere in the north. Well, fast forward to today, and the scene out there is very different. We've confirmed it much farther north than Pennsylvania today. So I say that because if deer are, have not been exposed to it, it tends to kill higher numbers, such as Pennsylvania. We've only had confirmed it a few different times. So when our deer are exposed to it, they tend to die at higher rates than deer, say, in Florida or Georgia or Mississippi or places, where those deer see some of it every year. So we've had a couple really bad outbreaks within the last decade, kind of 100-year storm type things. In 2012, it was awful. Fast forward, just a few years, we had another 100-year event. So there's a lot more deer hunters that are being impacted by hemorrhagic disease today than a decade or more ago. You may notice some deer that you shoot, if the hooves look like they have sloughing on them or lines that you see on them, those are often the results of a deer that had the disease and survived. So what happens when they have it, their hooves actually stop growing. And so there are ways to tell, if you shoot a deer in the future that actually did have it. Most hunters, though, what they'll see with this disease, these are where the deer, or the disease causes a fever in a deer and hemorrhaging around the heart. So these deer often go to water. The disease tends to be worse in drought years. So if all of a sudden, you start finding a bunch of dead deer around ponds or rivers, those are almost always the result of hemorrhagic disease.
So in drought years, is it because these midges that are contracting or that are spreading this disease? Is it because the water is going to be so much more localized, or more deer are going to be in those localized areas? Is that typically why it's worse in drought
Yep,
years?
that's certainly part of it. Deer end up, in those areas, so they're congregating in areas, which makes it easier for the midges to transfer the disease. It's also that, in drought years, you look at ponds and that, how you'll have vegetation at the top, then all of a sudden, when the water level's down, you have that mud ring around the pond. Those mud rings are the perfect ground for the midges. So you have perfect conditions for the midges, and you're congregating all these deer into smaller areas. So it's a perfect storm for the midges to really whack a bunch of deer and transfer the disease.
Now, do they typically enter through like open cavities, like like the nose, or are they actually able to burrow into the skin? I mean, how are they actually getting inside the deer to spread the EHD?
They're actually they're actually biting them, and what they'll do is they'll bite a
Okay.
deer. And, so if a midge is not carrying the disease, it'll bite a deer and take a blood meal. If that deer has the disease, then midge can actually pick it up, and then when that midge goes and bites another deer, it can then actually move the disease to that deer. So they're actually biting, and that's how they're transferring it. Hemorrhagic disease is important from an agricultural standpoint because cows can actually get it. They can, cattle do get hemorrhagic disease. There's a bunch of other species that we hunt, big game stuff that can get it as well. But cattle can, humans cannot, which is good. But a cattle can. So the Department of Ag, is often interested in this as well. Large scale, though, we certainly get deer die-offs from this. Sometimes there can be quite a few deer, but long term, deer rebound pretty quickly, and this is not a devastating disease of deer like chronic wasting disease can be. So we can shift gears and talk about that. CWD, long term, is a much bigger deal. CWD, it's a prion disease. It kills deer by essentially eating holes in their brain. I say it's a prion disease because it is not caused by a bacteria or by a virus. Remember, hemorrhagic disease is by a virus. Um, since chronic wasting disease, or CWD, is not caused by a virus or bacteria, we don't have a way to kill it or to stop it. So it is caused by, it's a prion disease. Now, there are similar prion diseases in other species. Um, in the humans, it's called Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. There's a prion disease in cattle that's called BSE, or the mad cow disease. In sheep, it's
Yeah,
called
yeah.
scrapie. So there are similar prion diseases in different species. The one in deer called CWD or chronic wasting. This is bad because it's 100% fatal to all deer, as well as other things that we hunt: deer, whitetails, mule deer, elk, red deer, moose, reindeer, possibly others that we don't know of yet. But a lot of things that we like to chase around the woods, this thing can kill. So it's 100% fatal to all deer or anything that can get it. There's no vaccine, and there's no cure. So none of those are good for deer herds or the future of hunting. A couple of the really dangerous things about CWD is that deer can carry the disease for 18 to 24 months and not show any signs of it. So it has a really long incubation period. However, during that whole time it's carrying it, it can be shedding these prions that when other deer come in contact with them, other deer can become infected. A cow that has mad cow disease can't give it to another cow. Well, unless you grind that cow up and feed it to another cow. But if you have a whole pen of cows and one of them has mad cow, none of the others are going to get it. That's very different with deer. You have one that has it, and other deer that come in contact with it can get the disease.
Is that through like body fluid, or is that through some kind of contact? Or I mean, how is it specifically spread? Through saliva, or how do they actually contract CWD?
That's a great question. It's through both ways that you said. We know that the prions are shed in saliva, urine, feces, and blood. And so when deer are in contact with each other, they're swap and spit at a mineral lick, or one's eaten, off the ground where another one has urinated or defecated, it's possible to transfer the disease. There's a lot of social grooming that goes on with deer. So it's that physical contact between deer that have it or contact with deer in the environment. So what I mean by that is, where deer urinate, defecate, those prions are left there in that soil, and we don't have a good way to decontaminate those soils. So deer that come in contact with parts of the environment where other CWD positive deer have left the prions can also become impacted. So yeah, lots of ways that deer can share this with others, and that's one of the reasons that it's just so difficult to stop the spread of the disease.
How could baiting? I know baiting with like corn piles, baiting with mineral licks, and that kind of thing. A lot of states are kind of doing away with that. Is that partially influenced by this CWD? That can be spread through the like you said, the saliva that is in contact with the mineral lick.
Yep, absolutely, and that is almost the sole reason that states are going away with it. The science is very clear that at bait piles or even at feed sites, potential for disease transmission, the risk of transferring these is much higher because of that swap and spit and all that stuff. So yeah, that's why when a state confirms CWD or a region of a state, they find it in almost every single case. The first thing that happens is there's no more baiting or feeding. If those things were legal before it was.
Yeah, here in Kentucky, we have the ability to bait if we want to, and we can put corn out and that kind of thing. That's definitely come November. That's a very common thing to see. See people in Walmart with 3 or 4 bags of corn. And is it a possibility that I know Kentucky right now isn't in the CWD zone, but as you get closer to the borders of other states, is it a possibility that deer that are exposed to CWD or are carrying CWD could come over and spread it that way? I mean, just because we have a lot of states that are close by that could potentially have CWD carrying deer.
Yeah, absolutely. And the two best ways to move the disease are one, moving live deer, deer farms, where they move deer between facilities. There's no good practical live animal test. The only way to test for sure with this is through a post-mortem test. So there are a couple live animal tests that work fairly well. Actually, they work good on deer that are in advanced stages of CWD. They don't work very good at all in the early stages, and they really don't work on elk much at all. So because there's not a good live animal test, there's a lot of deer moved legally and illegally that have the disease that we just don't know. So that's a very easy way to move it around. Um, from a hunting standpoint, It's also very easy to move this disease by moving the high risk parts of deer carcasses, of deer that we shoot. These prions accumulate in the eyes, the brain, the spleen, the lymph nodes, the backbone. So when you shoot a deer, say somebody from your area in Kentucky goes to Wisconsin, shoots a deer that has CWD, if they take the deer home, dump the carcass in your area of Kentucky, that is a perfect way to move the disease to your area. So because of that, that's why a lot of states today do not allow you to bring those high risk parts in from states that have CWD, and there's a growing number of states that do not allow you to bring those parts in from any state, regardless if that state's found CWD or not. And so those are safety measures, and those are good safety measures. I'm a hunter. I travel to hunt. It's an inconvenience, to have to bone that deer out or bone that meat out before you can move it. But man, it's an inconvenience well worth our time as hunters to make sure that we're not contributing to the problem, the spread of CWD.
Yeah, it definitely seems like it. It's crazy to think about that something so tragic for a population could be spread so easily, and it just comes down to the diligence of the hunters to make sure that we're doing the things that we need to do. I mean, as hunters, part of that title comes conservationists. We have to consider the whole health of wildlife in order to continue to be able to use these resources. And I mean, if that's the what we have to do in order to be able to do that, then I guess that's just something that we're just going to have to deal with just to prevent these terrible diseases from spreading.
Now that's right, and there's a lot of hunters that just simply aren't even aware of those carcass transport restrictions, or
Right? Yeah.
even within a state or certainly between states. So we at QDMA, we're trying to let hunters know, hey man, make sure you know what those rules are, and make sure you tell your hunting buddies, especially if they're headed out of state. So kind of a rule of thumb is, when in doubt, bone it out. If you're not sure if you can move the carcass or not, leave the carcass there, or send it to a landfill, but just moving meat in that, get that backbone out of there so that you're not going to take it home and end up, inadvertently moving the disease to a new area.
Absolutely. And interesting that you mentioned moving elk and hunting elk and that kind of thing, because in Kentucky we have a reestablished reestablished population. I know QDMA is not really going to work with a whole lot with elk, but I guess this same kind of thing really is going to apply. But we have a reestablished population within the past 30 years of elk in our southeastern area of the state, and a lot of those elk came from the Rocky Mountain area. So, is it a possibility though that as we're moving these elk, one of them could be carrying CWD, and then of course that's going to continue to spread? You said there's really not a whole lot of live tests that we're actually able to do at this point.
Now that's right, and so yes, there's absolutely the possibility, when you're restocking populations like that you can move animals that have the disease. Fortunately for elk, they just carry the disease at a much lower rate than whitetails or mule deer, so it's less likely in elk, but it's the chance is not zero for sure. And QDMA, we have a very public policy that we think there should be no live movement of deer or elk by hunters, by captive deer farmers, or by state wildlife agencies. There's not a good live animal test, so we're telling captive farmers don't move them, and we think agencies should follow that same advice. And in fact, the state of Utah this past year did implement that change. They used to move quite a few mule deer from towns, from urban areas. They'd trap them and relocate them in other parts of the state. And partly because of disease concerns, they've changed their policy, and the state of Utah is no longer moving any live animals. So, there's certainly a lot of deer and elk that have been moved in the past, and we understand that. But as we learn more about potential dangers of this, we don't think anybody ought to be moving them, at least until we get a much more reliable live animal test. And there's folks working on them, so that's a good thing.
Right, and that certainly makes sense. I mean, it makes sense to err on the side of caution, especially when it comes to something that we don't have a vaccine for. We don't have any way currently to stop it, and it just seems the logical thing seems to be to make sure that you're doing everything that we can not to spread it, and just by simply keeping populations, keeping deer, keeping animals in the areas that they're in right now. It definitely makes sense.
Yeah, and there's a lot that we don't know about CWD, but we're learning more all the time, and so what we tell people is, hey, don't move the deer, don't move those high risk parts. Let's do what we can as hunters. And there's certainly things we can do to help, limit the spread. And hey, the science is going to catch up at some point. So let's buy time while researchers work on better ways, to stop this disease. And when we do find a cure or a way to really combat it, you know, if the disease is a limited spread, then that's just that much quicker that we can get rid of it. Right now, we don't know how to stop it, but fortunately, there's some really smart people working on a solution to that.
Absolutely, and that's a good way of putting it. Just buy time and until science can catch up to it. I think that's a great suggestion, a great thing that we can do. Now, are there actual characteristics? Are there geographical characteristics of what are making deer populations more susceptible, or is it going to be, just sheer numbers based on the number of deer in an area? What all factors are considered whenever you're looking at the landscape of CWD and how it's spreading over the past, couple decades? What are some of the factors that we have to consider with that?
Well, there's certainly some genetic issues at play there. All deer are susceptible. There's some genetic traits of deer that make some deer appears a little more susceptible, meaning they seem to come down with the disease a little bit quicker. So there's a little bit of genetics at play here. More than anything else, though, it's a difference in management regimes. Perfect example of that is Wisconsin and Illinois both found the disease at the same time back in late 2001 and confirmed it in early 2002. And at that time, it was in southern Wisconsin and northern Illinois, not all that far apart. Prevalence rate in
Right.
those areas was somewhere around 1%. Fast forward to today, the management actions taken are dramatically different between those two. Wisconsin basically took a hands-off approach for a long time, and today in some of those areas, prevalence rates are 20 to 50% in some segments of the deer population. Some of the adult bucks in those counties, over half of them, have the disease. In Illinois, where they continued with targeted removal, they would find a diseased animal and go and remove some of the animals around that through sharpshooting and working with the landowners. Today, they still have about the same prevalence rate. So, almost 20 years later, they've maintained an extremely low prevalence rate, whereas in Wisconsin, the prevalence rate has skyrocketed, and is still skyrocketing. So, while there are some differences, in terrain and genetics and that kind of thing, by far the biggest difference is how we attack it on the landscape.
Absolutely, absolutely. Have you seen a fairly even amount of exposures between bucks and does? Is one gender going to be more susceptible to it, or is it just going to be non-discriminatory? It's just going to attack whatever deer is available to it.
No, bucks are more likely to contract the disease than does, and adult bucks are about twice as likely to get it as adult does. So if you look at on a graph, adult buck prevalence rates tend to be the highest, followed by adult does, followed by yearling bucks, followed by yearling does. So there are definite differences in the sexes and then in between the ages, and that's why there is so much discussion about, hey, should we be protecting young bucks or not? And so some states have said we don't want to because we don't want them to turn into old bucks. Others have said we're going to continue to protect young bucks and make sure our hunters continue focusing on shooting antlerless deer so that they don't let these deer herds grow too high and we lose the battle from the disease end that way. There's not an easy answer to that, though. Every situation is a little bit different. Researchers are really battling with that management strategy right now. State agencies are battling on which side of that they should be on, because of those prevalence rate differences in the ages and sexes. So, and there's a lot of hunters right in the middle of that debate. So that's one of the things that keeps the discussions on CWD always lively, and and a lot of people on both sides of the fence.
Yeah, it definitely sounds like it. Definitely sounds like of course, white-tailed deer hunting, just the culture in general. Of course, we're all going to love those mature, wise, old bucks. And whenever we have something that's threatening that, that's of course just it's not going to be good for hunting in general. Just it's not going to be good for just the populations in general. And that's so it's very I'm very appreciative as a hunter, as a whitetail hunter, to have organizations like the QDMA and I have researchers out there that are looking for possible solutions to a rapidly growing problem. I mean, it's a task that is, I'm sure, is very, very difficult because the clock is ticking at this point. I'm sure it's very difficult for these organizations to catch up and to try to find just some kind of answer to slow this down. I mean, at this point, is there really a whole lot other than kind of what we touched on with the preventing the spreading and preventing travel, that kind of thing? Are there specific additional things that can be done? I mean, whether on the hunter's end or whether on legislative end or that kind of thing.
Well, actually, yes, on the legislative end, we have been working with legislators and other conservation organizations to provide some funding to state agencies to help manage this. When this was first confirmed in Wisconsin back in '02, there was close to $20 million of federal funding available for state wildlife agencies to, test for this disease and to figure out, the abundance of it and the spread of it. Very quickly, they figured out that, this probably cannot jump the species barrier to humans. So all of that funding went away. So for the large parts today, states are left, on their own to come up with those funds to help test, deer for CWD and monitor it. So from the legislation end, absolutely, we can provide some federal funding, and there are a handful of bills out there right now that would provide that money. So that is very good. From the hunter's end, we can make sure that we don't move those high risk carcass parts around. We can make sure we tell our hunt buddies, not to do that. Stay engaged with what our wildlife agencies are asking us to do and what they're doing, and make sure we continue to harvest, enough antlerless deer to keep deer herds in balance with habitats, particularly in these disease areas, where we don't want those deer herds to grow too high. One thing that we do know about this is as once we find it in an area, um, if we do reduce those deer herds, we can limit the spread because most of this is spread from deer to deer. So if deer are not coming in contact with as many other deer, then we can keep it to a smaller area longer. And so as hunters, we can play a huge role in helping out. And from our agency's end, we can certainly dedicate time and resources to figuring out exactly where it is, and then working with our hunters to be great partners to manage those deer herds. And I'm a big fan of engaging hunters and the state wildlife agencies, and I firmly believe that we have to work more closely together between agencies and hunters than ever before. Certainly ever before in my career. You know, on managing CWD and battling this disease to win this one. And I'm an optimist. I fully believe we will win it, but it's going to take a bunch of work from all parties involved to make that happen.
Absolutely, it's definitely going to have to be a team effort whenever you're facing this monster that is named CWD and is something that can totally wipe out populations quickly. You mentioned there, the jumping from deer to humans. I mean, is it a possibility? Is, I guess, a better way of saying it is, if we were to potentially eat or accidentally eat an animal or a deer, an elk, or whatever may be carrying CWD, is it harmful to humans to consume that meat?
Well, all the research done thus far, they have never infected a human, and it appears that there's the species barrier between deer with CWD and humans is pretty strong. Meaning, it looks like humans cannot get it. We can never say for sure that they won't, though. But thus far, it looks like we can. However, both the Centers for Disease Control and the World Health Organization both suggest that if you shoot a deer or an elk, in an area that has CWD, get it tested before you consume that meat. So that's our advice. Certainly, if you're hunting in one of these zones, go get it tested. Package the deer, process, do whatever you want, but just hold that deer until you get a satisfactory test back, and then eat it. That's the wise thing to do. I know people who have eaten CWD positive deer, and I'm sure that we've eaten them for a long time. However, nobody wants to be the first to come down with a disease. So get it tested, hold on to it. Once you know that get a satisfactory test back, then go ahead and enjoy the heck out of that venison. But that's just good advice to follow for anybody hunting in zones that do have the disease.
Absolutely. How long does that testing process take? I mean, is it fairly quick? Because I'm thinking more of the from the hunter side. You've harvested this meat. You want to make sure that it stays fresh. I mean, are we talking a few days, or I mean, a month? I mean, how long does it take for that result process to get back to you?
That varies across the United States, and unfortunately, it's still kind of long. Um, 2 weeks to 3 or 4 weeks is about average. That's faster than it's been in the past. And what happens is now, where there's just more CWD in the landscape and more people testing, there's just a bottleneck at the facilities that can test for it. So if you're an entrepreneur, Tyler, that'd be a great thing to do, is establish some new test sites or testing facilities, because there is more demand to have animals tested than we currently have supply. So the agencies recognize that as a roadblock, and that's one thing that we have to overcome. We have to come up with a quicker test. That somebody doesn't have to wait 2 weeks or more. I was actually spoke at a CWD event in central Pennsylvania last week. There was a personnel there from the Pennsylvania Game Commission. Said that they are committed to getting tests back this year, and the majority of them will be back within 2 weeks. And so that's at the head of the curve. There's people in other states waiting a lot longer, but it's still a long time. So we have to make that shorter, and it's going to take more testing facilities and more supplies for that to make that happen. But we're definitely headed in that direction.
Right, and it's kind of one of those things that you also have to balance too, because I mean, of course, you want to make sure that you're not going to be consuming something like you said. You don't want to be the first one to contract something that could potentially be harmful. And then, I mean, it's kind of you may have to wait a couple of weeks, but at the same time, you at least will have the peace of mind knowing that the meat that you're eating is going to be healthy for you and your family and your friends and that kind of thing to be able to consume. And it's just that peace of mind is something that I think is worth the little bit of time that you have to wait for being able to consume that meat at that time.
No, I agree, and and most people, the chances of it having the disease is pretty low. So, but still, wait and see. I have friends that hunt in the core area of CWD in Wisconsin that over the last few years, literally, 50% of the deer they shoot have it. So when you shoot a deer, it's literally a flip of a coin whether it's going to have it or not. So, you know, those people are acutely aware of the need to have those tested before they eat them. And man, I just hope that the vast majority of deer hunters never end up in a situation like some of my friends there are dealing with.
Right, absolutely. That's not something that you want to necessarily be messing around with. But as we're kind of winding down here, we're bumping up against time. There's always one question that I like to ask my guest, and I didn't really prep you for this, so I'm interested in seeing what you come up with. But on a personal level, what does hunting mean to you?
Oh, hunting is just part of who I am, Tyler. I have had the opportunity to work with a lot of hunters over the years. Some people hunt just to go and kind of be at camp with their friends. Some people hunt for food. Some people just kind of like to associate themselves with camouflage and bows or guns. And there's others like me that, man, hunting is just part of who I am, and I literally would be an entirely different person if not for the exposure to the woods at a very young age, and all the deer camps and turkey camps that I've been in. So hunting is extremely important to me. Some of the best days of the year that I spend with my young son and my young daughter are in deer stands or chasing squirrels or turkeys. It's way more than just the food value, and we eat a tremendous amount of wild game in my house over the year. We give a lot of wild game to friends and family. But that part is certainly very, very important. But it goes far beyond that. I've said on numerous occasions to friends and at seminars that I've given, I feel really bad for those people who will never experience the magic of the woods. And a lot of those magical times have happened, when we didn't bring any game home. It was just certain experiences with family or friends that happened while we were afield. So suffice to say, hunting is very important to me, and is absolutely critical to who I am as a person.
Absolutely. I can definitely agree with that. And it's funny that you mentioned, being able to share the woods and being able to share the hunting experience with your kids. I've got a 5-year old, he's getting to turn 6, and I've just took him on his first dove hunt this past weekend. And he absolutely loved it. I mean, he was running around picking up birds. I mean, he had a good old time, and I've taken him to on some turkey hunts with me and some deer hunts with me and stuff, and just being able to have that opportunity to be able to introduce our kids and being able to just to share this thing that we're so passionate about, to share this thing that's a part of us. So like you said, it's just an incredible experience, and being able to give family and friends some wild game that we had the opportunity to go out and harvest. And it's a very unique opportunity, and there's quite literally nothing else like it. And it becomes ingrained into who we are as people, into who we are as hunters, quite frankly.
I agree. I'm a better person because I'm a hunter, and there's a lot of wildlife in my area that benefit from my habitat efforts because I'm a hunter. So, yeah, I certainly wouldn't want to give that part of me up.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. So, if listeners are wanting to learn more about QDMA, where do you suggest that they go check it out?
They can go to our website, which is qdma.com. All kinds of information there on managing deer and about hunting and about habitat. So all free for the taking. They can go there and grab that. If they wanted to contact me directly, I'm glad to answer any questions or help any way I can. My email address is kadams, KADAMS, at qdma.com. I help folks around the country every day, and I'm glad to help any of your listeners if I'm able to.
Well, I appreciate you taking some time today. I really do. It was a great conversation, and I learned a whole lot about just deer diseases, and just basically getting rid of some of the old myths that kind of get thrown around, through social media and through the news and that kind of thing, and just being able to hear it from the source and be able to hear it from somebody who's literally in the field and getting things done. So I appreciate you taking some time to talk with me tonight.
All right, you got it. My pleasure, and certainly good luck in the woods this fall.
All right, thank you very much. You too. I appreciate you. Thanks again.